welcome to English Vibes Hub. I'm Emma, and I'm here with Liam today. We're super excited to talk about something really practical and useful for all of you who are looking to improve your English listening skills. Today's topic is all about mastering daily conversations at the post office. How often do you visit the post office, Liam?
Actually, Emma, I don't go to the post office that often, but when I do, I notice that there are so many different conversations you can have there. From sending packages to buying stamps, it's a great place to practice your English. And I think one of the key phrases we should cover today is pick up. For example, if you're expecting a package, you might say, "I'm here to pick up a package." Can you explain a bit more about this phrase, Emma?
Absolutely, Liam. Pick up is a great phrasal verb that means to collect or gather something. So, in the context of the post office, it could mean collecting a package that's been delivered for you. Another example could be, I need to pick up some stamps before I send this letter. It's really versatile and useful in many situations. Let's think about another phrasal verb that might be useful at the post office. How about send off? What do you think it means, Liam?
That's a good one, Emma. I think send off means to dispatch or mail something. For instance, if you're at the post office and you want to mail a package, you could say, "I'd like to send this package off to my friend." Is that correct? And what about fill out? I've seen forms at the post office that need to be filled out before you can send something.
That's right, Liam. Send off does indeed mean to mail or dispatch something. And fill out is another fantastic phrasal verb that means to complete a form by writing in the required information. At the post office, you might need to fill out a form to send a package, especially if it's going abroad. For example, could you fill out this customs form, please? It's a really common request. Let's give our listeners an example of how these phrasal verbs can be used in a conversation at the post office.
Okay, so let's say I'm at the post office and I want to send a package to my friend who lives in another country. I might say to the clerk, "Hi, I'd like to send this package off to my friend. Could you help me fill out the customs form?" The clerk might then ask me what's in the package or where are you sending it to, and I could respond with, "It's a gift and I'm sending it to Paris." How does that sound, Emma?
That sounds perfect, Liam. You're using the phrasal verbs send off and fill out in a really natural way. And that's exactly what we want our listeners to be able to do to use these verbs confidently in their everyday conversations. Now, let's talk about another scenario. What if you need to track a package that you've sent? What kind of conversation might you have at the post office then?
If I needed to track a package, I might say to the clerk, "Hi, I'm trying to track a package I sent last week. Can you help me?" The clerk might then ask for the tracking number, and I could say, "It's right here on the receipt." Then the clerk could look it up on the computer and tell me where my package is. It's really straightforward, but it's a great opportunity to practice your English, especially if you're not sure what the clerk is saying.
Exactly, Liam. And that's where active listening comes in. If you're not sure what the clerk is saying, you can always ask them to repeat or clarify what they mean. For example, "Sorry, could you repeat that?" Or "What do you mean by that?" It's completely okay to ask for clarification, and it's a big part of mastering daily conversations at the post office. Let's keep exploring more scenarios and phrasal verbs that our listeners can use in their everyday conversations.
I think another useful phrasal verb is look up. If you're trying to find a specific type of stamp or a certain postal service, you might say, "Could you look up the price of this stamp for me?" Or, "I'm trying to find out how much it costs to send a package to the UK. Could you look that up for me?" It's a really helpful verb to know, especially when you're dealing with a lot of different options and prices.
That's a great example, Liam. Look up is indeed a very useful phrasal verb, and it can be used in so many different contexts. At the post office, it could mean searching for information on the computer or in a book. For instance, if you're trying to find out the postal code for a specific address, you might say, "Could you look up the postal code for me?" And the clerk would then search for that information and provide it to you. It's all about using the right language in the right situation, and that's what we're focusing on today.
I think we've covered some really useful phrasal verbs so far, Emma. We've talked about pick up, send off, fill out, and look up. All of these verbs are essential for having effective conversations at the post office. And I think our listeners are getting a good sense of how to use them in different scenarios. But let's not stop there. What's another situation that our listeners might encounter at the post office, Emma?
Well, Liam, one situation that comes to mind is when you need to complain about a service or a problem you're having with a package. For example, if your package hasn't arrived on time, you might say, "I'm so frustrated. My package was supposed to arrive last week, but it still hasn't shown up. Can you help me?" The clerk might then apologize and offer to help you track down the package. It's a great opportunity to practice using more formal language and complaining politely.
That's a great point, Emma. Complaining politely is a really important skill to have, especially in a customer service situation like the post office. And it's not just about using the right language. It's also about being respectful and courteous, even if you're frustrated. So let's talk about some phrases that our listeners can use to complain politely at the post office. What are some examples, Emma?
One phrase that comes to mind is I'm having some trouble with. For example, I'm having some trouble with my package. It was supposed to arrive last week, but it still hasn't shown up. This phrase is really helpful because it states the problem clearly and politely. Another phrase could be I'm not sure what's going on with. For instance, I'm not sure what's going on with my package, but I was told it would arrive by now. These phrases are great because they show that you're not sure what's happening, but you're willing to work with the clerk to find a solution.
I think those are really useful phrases, Emma, and I think our listeners are getting a good sense of how to use them in different situations. But let's keep going. What's another scenario that our listeners might encounter at the post office, Emma?
Well, Liam, one scenario that comes to mind is when you need to ask for help or clarification. For example, if you're not sure how to fill out a form or you need help tracking a package, you might say, "Excuse me, could you help me with this?" Or "I'm not sure what this means. Could you explain it to me?" These phrases are really helpful because they show that you're willing to ask for help and that you're not afraid to admit when you don't know something.
I think that's a great point, Emma. Asking for help is a really important part of mastering daily conversations at the post office. And it's not just about asking for help, it's also about being open to feedback and willing to learn. So let's talk about some phrases that our listeners can use to ask for help or clarification at the post office. What are some examples, Emma?
One phrase that comes to mind is "Could you explain that to me?" For example, "I'm not sure what this form means. Could you explain it to me?" This phrase is really helpful because it shows that you're willing to learn and that you're not afraid to ask for help. Another phrase could be "I'm not sure I understand. Could you repeat that?" For instance, "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that. Could you repeat that?" These phrases are great because they show that you're actively listening and that you're willing to ask for clarification when you need it.
I think those are really useful phrases, Emma, and I think our listeners are getting a good sense of how to use them in different situations. Let's keep exploring more scenarios and phrases that our listeners can use to master daily conversations at the post office.
Sounds like a plan, Liam. Let's dive deeper into some more scenarios and phrases that our listeners can use to improve their English conversations at the post office. Maybe we can talk about what to say when you're sending a package, or how to ask about postal rates and services. What do you think, Liam?
That sounds like a great idea, Emma. I think our listeners would really benefit from learning more about those topics. And who knows, maybe we'll even get to talk about some of the more unusual things you can send through the post office, like live animals or unusual packages. That could be a fun conversation to have.
Yes, that could be a fun conversation to have, Liam. And it's a great way to think about all the different scenarios that our listeners might encounter at the post office. Okay, so let's get started on that topic. What do you think is the most important thing to consider when sending a package, Liam?
Well, Emma, I think one of the most important things to consider is making sure you have the right packaging materials. You don't want your package to get damaged in transit, so it's a good idea to use sturdy boxes and plenty of padding. And of course, you need to make sure you have the right address and postage on the package, or it might not arrive at its destination.
That's a great point, Liam. Having the right packaging materials and making sure the address and postage are correct are crucial when sending a package. And it's also a good idea to consider the weight and size of the package, as well as any special handling instructions. For example, if you're sending a fragile item, you might want to mark the package as fragile so that the postal workers handle it with care.
Exactly, Emma. And it's also a good idea to consider the cost of shipping and whether you need to purchase any additional services, such as tracking or insurance. That way, you can make sure your package arrives safely and on time, and you can keep track of its progress along the way.
Okay, so let's summarize what we've covered so far. We've talked about some of the key phrases and scenarios that our listeners might encounter at the post office, including sending packages, tracking packages, and asking for help. We've also covered some of the most important things to consider when sending a package, such as packaging materials, address and postage, weight and size, and special handling instructions. Now, let's move on to the next topic. What do you think we should cover next, Liam?
Well, Emma, I think we should cover some of the more common questions that people have when visiting the post office. For example, what are the postal rates and services available? How do you track a package? What are the hours of operation for the post office? Those are all important questions that our listeners might have, and we can provide them with some helpful answers and phrases to use in those situations.
That's a great idea, Liam. Let's dive into those topics and provide our listeners with some helpful information and phrases to use. We can start with postal rates and services. What are some of the different types of postal services that are available, Liam?
Well, Emma, there are several different types of postal services available, including first-class mail, priority mail, and parcel post. Each of these services has its own set of rates and delivery times, so it's a good idea to understand the differences between them when you're sending a package.
That's right, Liam. And it's also a good idea to consider the weight and size of the package, as well as the destination, when choosing a postal service. For example, if you're sending a package to another country, you might need to use a different type of postal service than if you were sending it within your own country.
Exactly, Emma, and that's why it's so important to understand the different postal services and rates that are available. By doing so, you can make sure you're getting the best value for your money and that your package arrives safely and on time.
Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. What are some of the most common questions that people have when visiting the post office, Liam?
Well, Emma, one of the most common questions people have is how long will it take for my package to arrive? Or what is the tracking number for my package? Those are both great questions, and we can provide our listeners with some helpful phrases to use when asking them.
That's right, Liam. And we can also provide them with some helpful information about how to track a package and what to do if it doesn't arrive on time. Let's dive into that topic and provide our listeners with some helpful tips and phrases to use.
I'm looking forward to it, Emma, and I'm sure our listeners are too. Let's get started and see where the conversation takes us.
Now that we've explored various scenarios at the post office, I think it's time for us to wrap up and share some final thoughts. One thing that's really important is to pick up on the cues the postal worker is giving you, like when they ask for your ID or your address.
Absolutely, Emma, and I think another useful phrasal verb in this context is sort out. For example, if there's an issue with your package, you might need to sort out the problem with the postal worker.
Exactly, Liam. Sorting out problems is a big part of communicating effectively, especially in a place like the post office where things can get complicated. And speaking of complicated, have you ever had to fill in a form at the post office?
Oh yes, I've had to fill in plenty of forms in my time, and it can be a real challenge, especially if you're not sure what information is required. But it's a great opportunity to practice your English skills, like asking for clarification or repeating back what you've understood.
That's such a good point, Liam. And it's also important to follow up after you've sent a package to make sure it's arrived safely and that the recipient is happy with it. You can do this by sending a quick email or making a phone call.
Following up is a great way to show that you care about the person you're sending the package to, and that you're willing to go the extra mile to ensure everything goes smoothly. And finally, I think it's worth mentioning the phrase, get to the point, which means to be clear and concise in your communication.
I love that phrase, Liam. Getting to the point is so important, especially in a busy place like the post office where people are often in a hurry. By being clear and direct, you can avoid confusion and make the whole process much more efficient.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, Emma. It's been a great conversation, and I hope our listeners have learned some useful phrases and tips for navigating the post office in English.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of English Vibes Hub, everyone. If you want to learn more about English conversations and improve your language skills, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel at English Vibes Hub S6W, and join us next time for more fun and informative episodes.
And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date with all our latest episodes and content. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.